Thank you so much. So I'd like to start kind of my story in 1997 when I first came to the US. I was originally working with adult women. I came originally to work with adult women coming out of the sex industry. And so in that first kind of literally few days, few weeks, few months, I began to go to Rikers Island prison and up to Hunts Point, which has been the subject of numerous pseudo-documentaries on HBO, and began to meet really young girls. I was going into an adult correctional facility and yet meeting 12, 13, 14-year-old girls who'd been told by their pimp to say that they were 17, 18, 19. It was incredibly obvious that they were nowhere close to that age. I was going out onto the streets. And for any of you who've seen any of those kind of HBO type docs, you know that for many, many years there's been areas in New York and in Chicago and all over the country where there's a very, very clear kind of prostitution track. And so there would be cars literally lined up on the street, and I would meet yet again 12, 13, 14-year-old girls who were out there being sold. And so I was 22 when I first came to the States, and as a survivor of commercial sexual exploitation myself as a teenager, I'd gotten out when I was 19 years old. I realized that I had a lot in common with these girls and young women that I was meeting. And the 40-year-old women at that point were like, what's this little girl going to tell me? Whereas the 19-year-olds were a little bit more receptive to this very bright-eyed 22-year-old. And so I realized, though, that even though we were from different continents and the girls would be like, where's your accent, miss? You sound like Sporty Spice. That we had very, very similar stories, and that, you know, that cultural difference was kind of overridden by the similarities of the commercial sex industry globally. And so our stories of growing up in poverty, our stories of growing up in traumatic homes where there was lots of domestic violence and substance abuse, our stories of kind of craving attention and love from our families and generally not getting that, our stories of kind of getting introduced into the commercial sex industry through a man or through kind of this moment of desperation and feeling like, okay, this is just something I'll do for the moment, and I'll figure out my way to get out, and then getting stuck. And our stories of being treated like we were less than by everyone in the community, our families, by law enforcement, by social workers, by hospital staff, they kind of rang the same, whether it was my experience or the experiences of the girls that I was serving. And so in 1998, I decided to start GEMS, which is Girls Educational and Mentoring Services, kind of based on my own experiences. And at that point, I had absolutely no money. I had no idea even how to write. I think I was just beginning to learn how to write a proposal. And so I started GEMS literally on my kitchen table, and girls would sleep on my couch and eat my food and wear my clothes and not bring my clothes back. And so that was about as grassroots as you can kind of get in terms of starting a nonprofit. And I was 23, so I had no idea what starting a nonprofit would look like, which was really, really good. So I began to work with girls and young women who were being trafficked. And at that point, though, we weren't using that terminology, trafficking. And so trafficking kind of came into our lexicon. Really, it began to come in 2000 when the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, federal legislation, was passed. And so the handful of us that were working with domestic trafficking victims were really excited and thought, okay, this is the moment where our girls and young women and adult women begin to be treated as victims, not as criminals. And then we realized very quickly that there was this kind of two-tiered system. And so in terms of how the funding was structured, in terms of how the training for law enforcement and service providers, in terms of how kind of the media and the public began to view this issue over the years, it was like, well, there's those real trafficking victims. There's those girls from Mexico or from Asia or from the Ukraine. And, you know, there's those teen prostitutes from America who just kind of want to do this and they like doing this. And so the battle over the last really kind of decade and change for us has been about really trying to educate people that the sexual exploitation and trafficking of girls and young women and adult women in this country looks the same as it does for girls and women globally, and that you don't have to be from another country to feel like you don't have options in this country, right? We're very good at doing the Horatio Alger, pull yourself up by your bootstraps kind of myth, but if we're being honest, opportunities aren't equal in this country, and there are entire segments of our young people for whom opportunities are frequently denied. And so that's what we've continuously found. And I will say that I think if this issue had affected the number of low-income girls of color that we've seen over the last 15 years, both in New York and all over the country, if it had affected white middle-class girls in that same way, we would have seen a very, very different social and political response by now. We had to educate people too that just because you weren't undocumented didn't mean you trusted law enforcement and went running to law enforcement and said, "Hi, Mr. Police Officer, please rescue me." Right? We understand that for women and men who are trafficked globally, whether for sex or labor, that right, their experiences with law enforcement in their own countries haven't been particularly warm, and so they may not feel like this is someone that they can go to. That's true for young people in our country too, particularly young people who've grown up in communities of color that historically don't have good reason to trust law enforcement. And we also had to teach people that you don't have to be chained physically to a bed or to a wall in order to think that you can't leave. And with the domestic violence movement, we've begun to really work over the last 30 years at stopping folks from saying, well, why doesn't she just leave? And we began to recognize that it was a lot more complex than that, right? And that there were many psychological and sociological factors that would stop an adult woman from leaving an abuser. And so when we're talking about particularly children, when we're talking about girls who are under the control of somebody whose entire job it is to make them loyal and compliant, we have to be able to apply those same kind of ideas that we've come up with domestic violence and recognize that you don't, the physical chains may not be there, but psychological chains are much, much stronger. And right, when we think about someone like Elizabeth Smart or Sean Hornbeck, who was the little boy who was found in Missouri several years after his kidnapping, or J.C. Dugard, right? We generally don't ask, why didn't they just leave? We recognize Stockholm Syndrome and trauma bonding, and we recognize whatever was done to those young people in the first few days, first few hours was enough to keep them psychologically trapped and bonded, and for them to believe that they couldn't leave. So that's kind of been the work over the last 15 years, and slowly we're beginning, in the last maybe year, 18 months, we're beginning to see kind of some level of change and this kind of slow shift in public perception where we're beginning to see more media stuff and we're beginning to see kind of folks shifting their perception of who these girls are, who these women are. And so, I mean, I think one of the most critical things that we've been able to do and that we did in New York was be able to change, not just kind of in concept, but actually in policy, this idea that young people were victims, not criminals. And so for many years, as I was working in juvenile detention and like I said, on the streets and up in Rikers Island, I was seeing 12 and 13, 14, 15, 16-year-old girls who were being arrested and charged with an act of prostitution that under New York state law, they couldn't legally consent to because they couldn't legally consent to sex until they were 17. And so in any other case, they would have been a victim of statutory rape. And yet, because money was exchanged, the 40-year-old, the 30-year-old, the adult man who was buying them was no longer seen as a statutory rapist. He was seen just as a John, and he was generally let go with a little pat, same way we used to treat domestic violence abusers for many, many years. And the girl, the child who was being bought, the child who was being sold by adult men to adult men was the one who was arrested, incarcerated, and generally sentenced to a year. We had one case, and this is the case that kind of started the whole thing off, where we had a 12-year-old who was arrested. She was sentenced upstate to a juvenile detention center for a year. She had been in the foster care system. She had been totally abandoned by family. She had a massive history of trauma and abuse and had met an adult man who became her daddy, who became her pimp. And the judge said she needed to learn proper moral principles. And so that was the case that kind of, we said, something's wrong with this legislation. Something's wrong with a law that doesn't protect victims, but sees them, children, as criminals and isn't addressing this as a human rights issue. And yet we've got federal law that recognizes children from other countries as victims, and technically does recognize children from our country's victims, but it's not happening at a state level. And so for about 4.5 years, the young women at GEMS and I trekked up to Albany. We worked very closely with the Legal Aid Juvenile Rights Division. And in the beginning, we would go in a room and it would be 4 legislators, and they were totally bored and apathetic. And we would go back and we would go back again. And the girls would say, it's all white men in suits. And so, yes, let's have a conversation about power and privilege and what that looks like. And so it became kind of a civics participation lesson in action over the course of about 4.5, 5 years. And eventually we were able to make New York State the first state in the country to protect, not prosecute, children who have been sexually exploited and trafficked. That happened in 2008. We were very conscious of kind of what could happen globally, nationally with that law. And since then, 9 other states have passed similar, what they're calling safe harbor legislation. So we are now 10 states down, 40 to go. I would like to believe in 5 years we will look back like we look back on many other issues and think, did we really send 12-year-olds to jail? Did we really let the adult men who are doing the buying and selling go? That seems ludicrous. We don't live in that kind of country. So I believe that we have the ability to get there. But I think what's critical and what we need to kind of, the next layer of where we're going in the anti-trafficking movement, the ending commercial sexual exploitation movement, is really about kind of making sure that we're tying these issues, the issue of sexual exploitation, into like these larger systemic issues. Because oftentimes what we're finding now with the media focus on this issue, and for anybody who's seen kind of a MSNBC special or something in the newspaper, right, it tends to be very sensationalized and very kind of rescue little girls, bad men, arrest them, right? It tends to be that kind of paradigm, and yet we're not addressing the social factors that make young people so incredibly vulnerable in the first place. Like I said, right, predominantly what we are seeing are low-income girls, girls of color, girls who've been in the child welfare system. Over 70% of the girls that GEM serves have been in the child welfare system at some point. Girls who have been victims of childhood sexual abuse and trauma. We know that anywhere from 70 to 90% of both children and adult women who end up in the sex industry were victims of child sexual abuse prior to recruitment, right? There's no other industry in the world that targets folks who have been victims of childhood sexual abuse, one of the most traumatic things that you can experience, in such a way, right, that preys upon the most vulnerable people in our society, some of the most marginalized folks in our entire community. And so we have to be able to address some of these root causes. We have to be able to address, right, opportunities for all of our young people and make sure that we are not predicating what your future looks like for as a young person based on the zip code that you are born into. We need to make sure that we are addressing kind of some of these larger systemic issues, particularly gender-based violence. And I will say that, you know, for the last couple of years, there was a point where you couldn't get like 3 people in a room to talk about this. And then there was a point where you began to get folks showing up, and now, right, you do an anti-trafficking workshop and there's a ton of people showing up. And yet we can't get folks now to come to a domestic violence presentation because we think we've solved it. We think we've addressed that. We think like it's one of those things we don't really need to focus on right now, and yet we know that domestic violence is happening now, and if I waited another few seconds, again and again in our country. And so we have to be able to address kind of the continuum of gender-based violence, of which commercial sexual exploitation and trafficking is just one component of. We have to be able to address race, and the impact of racism on young people in this country, and particularly how that plays out in the commercial sex industry. I will tell you that, and this isn't a talk about pornography, but I will tell you that pornography is one of the few, again, industries anywhere that you can still be latently racist. And I encourage you to kind of look at some of the links between race and pornography and how that plays out in our culture, and how we're still really comfortable in that world in terms of kind of addressing people through race and very racialized, sexualized stereotypes. We have to be able to kind of think, where do we want to be in 5 to 10 years on this issue? Because sometimes we can go, and I think this is true of all social justice movements, right? We can address kind of the very exciting, sexy topics, and not really dig deeper and go kind of long-term for the long-term gains. And so, right, every issue has its moment in the sun. And right now, kind of trafficking is having its moment, right? The domestic violence movement had its moment. The environment kind of had its moment. HIV/AIDS had its moment. And that's not to say that work isn't still being done, but there's a very particular point in time for every social justice issue where the focus is on it. Right, and there's a lot of momentum and a lot of excitement, and the media is all over it. And we're kind of hitting that point, and we're very close to hitting that point in the trafficking movement right now, but we have to think about what do we want to see kind of 5, 10, 15, 20 years out. And so some of those things might not be the most sexiest things that we can address, right? Arresting men and saving girls sounds like a good concept, but rescue isn't a long-term sustainable method of addressing folks' needs, right? We have to be looking from an empowerment perspective. I will say that, you know, just kind of looking at the Coney 2012 kind of video that, right, I mean, picked up, if you didn't see it, you were living under a rock, right? It just picked up this massive level of momentum. But I'll say there are some things that the anti-trafficking movement can kind of learn from that, right? It's critical that we are highlighting voices that are on the ground, and we are highlighting the voices of survivors, and not in a get up and tell your story way, right? As a survivor, and as somebody who's been kind of in a leadership role for many years, I'm still in positions where, you know, the focus becomes kind of the sensational aspects of my story, and what did you go through, and what did you experience, as opposed to the fact, right, as an executive director for the last 14 years, I actually have some ideas about like policy and programming and development, and right, and there's some of that stuff that I bring to the table, and while my story is critical in terms of informing the work that I do, right, it's one part of me. And if we're really serious about addressing victims and supporting victims into becoming survivors and then ultimately leaders, we have to think about how do we move from that very kind of, on some levels, voyeuristic kind of, I want to know all the ins and outs of all the violence and trauma and all the bad stuff that happened to you, right? And I could have gotten up here today and done that piece, but less helpful in terms of how we're thinking about this issue as a community, as a movement, right? We can learn from Coney the things that are sensational may get the attention, but they don't necessarily provide the most nuanced view of what's happening on the ground, and that the things that, you know, kind of may seem to make the most sense initially and appeal to our good, evil kind of, right? This is an incredibly complex issue, right? And we have to be able to address kind of economic empowerment. We have to be able to address education and employment for girls and women globally and in this country too, right? We've gotten much better about talking about kind of the need for economic empowerment for girls globally, but we're doing a pretty crappy job about recognizing that some of those same issues exist right here, right down the block from us, right in our own backyards. And so that kind of, that desire to address like the other, when it comes to particularly any issue, but particularly sex trafficking and having empathy for brown and black children in other countries, but not so much in our country, being able to address kind of services and support in other countries, but again, not in our own country, is somewhere that we have to kind of move away from. And so I encourage you to really just think about in the next, you know, kind of, you've got a lot to think about, right? You've heard a lot of different talks today, but I encourage you on this issue to really think about how can you tie this issue in with the work that you're doing, right? The next speaker is going to talk about economics, right? Sex trafficking and exploitation is totally connected to that. The amazing presentation today on PTSD and memory, right? That's connected. All of these issues are connected, and when we silo stuff off and make it kind of its own little issue, we do ourselves a disservice. So I'm going to wrap here, but thank you very much.